Okay, so today I'm just going to hand over to Paul McIntosh, and I will let him talk from this point on. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much, Lisa Mayer in Western Australia, and welcome Mary, who's in the middle of New South Wales, and Paul McIntosh, everybody. I'm in Mackay and been in Ayr yesterday, and it's a lot of rain up here, and there's plenty of water on the side of the roads, and due to the nature of the animal up here, I wasn't keen to go swimming in any water holes we're travelling last night. So water up here is good, and wish we can get more rain through the centre of Queensland and down in New South Wales. But in the meantime, we've got Mary O'Brien, who's a well-known person on our surface temperature inversion knowledge. And Mary, we're on this webinar today to seek some of your knowledge about how to identify surface temperature inversions and all things like that. So welcome, and I'll pass over to you for your first slide and talk about surface temperature inversion and avoidance of.
Thanks, Macca. Welcome everyone. Thanks, Lisa, for the intro as well. So today I'm just hopefully give people a little bit of an explanation about inversions and the risk associated with that with spray applications. Today is not to get into application stuff or setup or anything like that. It's really just some key information about surface temperature inversion. So hopefully people can find something useful out of it. I will say that I certainly don't consider myself an expert, and I'm not a climatologist at all. But having a background in regulation of chemical misuse, I've seen over the years a lot of the continuing problems out there and have a fair handle on the challenges that people are experiencing. So one of the key things that I've noticed over the years is the failure to be able to accurately or confidently identify inversions, and I see that as a major risk to our applications and to the continued access of products. So going to trying to get the next slide to come up now.
Click. Oh,
there we go. It's worked. Look at that. On the labels, we've seen for some time a variety of information around climate parameters and weather parameters for application of pesticides, and we commonly see things like that do not apply if there's a surface temperature inversion present at the site of application. Other products may have things like do not apply under meteorological conditions that are likely to cause drift, and I guess that second option is a fairly broad statement, sort of encompasses wind conditions as well as inversion. So that's telling us not to apply in very low winds or very high winds, as well as avoiding inversions. So some of the things that we're seeing now is a bit more information about surface temperature inversions on labels, and in particular with the introduction of the new 2,4-D permit across the 2,4-D products, that sort of removes any ambiguity between products and labels and gives us a fairly even and clear information about surface temperature inversions. So having a background in regulation, that information on labels is pretty important to applicators, because failing to comply with those labels and instructions on labels is certainly an offence under the state legislation. So understanding what's on the label is pretty critical. So I guess the main things about inversions is, what is it and how do we tell if there is one? During the day, when the sun gets up in the morning, it starts to heat the ground. We can't heat the air because it's clear. So what the sun does is heats the ground, and that will then heat the air next to the ground. And as that ground warms up and that air warms up, it's going to rise, and cool air from above will fall down into that space to fill that void, and it will get next to the ground, and it will then warm up and rise. And we start getting this cycle going, and this movement of air, so the rising of the warm air, the falling of the cool air, and it starts to create turbulence, and that's a really good thing. We need turbulence, and once we start to get that 3 to 4 kilometres an hour, it starts to be appropriate for spraying, because the reason we need that turbulence is to create that mixing and dilution of the air to bring our products to ground and get them where we want them. So once we get this turbulent motion of air, it's quite easy for us to determine the direction our spray particles may go and how far. And so that's how they are able to determine buffer zones and how far, you know, the risk is for products to move. So that daytime conditions, turbulent air movement is really important for us. And bear in mind, this is only during the day. I'm talking about during the day when the sun is up and we get that turbulence. So what happens late in the afternoon in most areas, wherever I go, I'll always ask the farmers, you know, what does the wind do about sundown? And their answer is always, it drops off. So that would usually be around that sunset period or just before sunset as the sun starts to sink. And what's actually happening is even in summertime when we have pretty hot ground, the ground actually cools quite rapidly. And it cools so rapidly, it cools the air next to it rapidly. And once that air starts to cool a bit, it's not going to rise. And this process happens so quickly that we're left with a layer of warm air above and that cool air close to the ground. And we don't have to have much science knowledge to know that that cool air is not going to rise and the warm air above is not going to sink. So it's the opposite of normal. Normal conditions, we would have warmer air close to the surface and the air temperature would decrease with height. So inversion is just the opposite of normal. It's inverted. So we have the cool air close to the surface, warm air above. We lose that turbulence. We're not getting that rising and falling of air. So our turbulence stops. And what happens to that air is it starts to move sideways, parallel to the surface, a bit like layers in plywood. There's no mixing, there's no dilution, there's no pulling to ground, and it becomes very difficult for us to predict the direction of how, you know, where that air is going to move. And so this increasingly becomes more dangerous as the night progresses and we approach dawn. So very parallel movement of air. And when it comes to those buffer zones, they're only going to work during the day when we have that turbulent motion and that mixing of air, that dilution. It's not going to apply at night. So buffer zones are really applicable during the day and a really good guide for us to protect sensitive areas. But during the night, I'm afraid they go out the window and buffer zones really have little to no effect at night. The other things that will impact it on the movement of that air is the topography of the region. So large mountain ranges, large bodies of water, slopes, rivers, etc. So that parallel movement of air across the landscape is generally going to flow like water towards the lowest parts of the catchment and will continue to flow parallel to the surface until the sun gets up the next morning and we start to get that heat in the ground and create that turbulent movement of the air again. So how do we know if there's an inversion? Well, there's some pretty good information out there, but lots of people don't like to read it. There's too many words. There's a fantastic book by Graham Tepper, which is available through the GRDC bookshop, or you can read it online through the GRDC website. And there's also the GRDC fact sheet written by Bill Gordon, which is basically a condensed version of information about the surface temperature inversions. And the new permit for 24D specifically refers to that fact sheet, so that middle document that you can see on your screens, that surface temperature inversion and spraying fact sheet. On the right screen there, I have condensed it down to a little trifold brochure, which is very much the Reader's Digest version, condensed dot points from that information. So what do those documents tell us? Those documents tell us that pretty much every night in Australia we have to expect an inversion unless we have one or more of these three things. So heavy low-level cloud, it's raining, or the wind speed remains above 11 kilometres an hour for the entire time between sunset and sunrise. So late in the afternoon, as the sun starts to drop, if that wind speed starts to drop down below 11 k's an hour, that's probably our first indicator that there's an inversion setting in. So if people plan to go spraying at night, then they really need to understand and watch what that wind does around sunset. That will certainly help them determine the risk factors as if they spray into the night. In that book by Graham Tepper, there's a pretty good diagram that sort of explains the difference between that day and inversion conditions. So on the left of this diagram, we have the normal conditions, daytime conditions, where we've got warm ground at the surface. Those arrows are showing us the wind speed, so wind speed increasing with height, and that red and blue line is showing air temperature. So air temperature warmer close to the ground and decreasing, getting cooler with height. So that's normal conditions when the sun's up during the day. On the other side of the diagram there, we have the inversion situation, so the opposite of normal. Flip it over, we've got cool ground, we've got cooler air temperature close to the surface, so that little blue bit down the bottom, and the air temperature getting warmer at height, and then above that inversion layer, going back to a normal temperature profile, getting cooler with height. And you can see that the wind is still there, but it's cut off by that inversion layer, so the synoptic winds are going.
You still there, Mary?
Mary, we've lost you.
Cut off from them, and our local landscape comes into play, and we'll start to get those drainage winds off slope.
Maz, it's Paul here. Can you go back about a minute, mate? We lost you completely there for one stage.
Lost me?
Yeah, back now, but we lost you for about a minute and a half.
Oh, really? Okay. So where did you lose me?
Just go back about a minute and a half, mate, you'll be fine. So we're onto the inversion profile of the cooling land on the right-hand side of your slide.
Yep, so that the cool ground and then the cool air close to the surface and warmer layer of air above it, and then above that inversion layer, the air temperature going back to cooling with height. And so that inversion layer is cutting us off from the synoptic winds, and the synoptic winds are still there, but we just are cut off by that inversion layer. And under that inversion layer, it becomes often quite still and very gentle breezes, and sometimes they can increase with speed. We'll get those cool drainage winds off slope, and the local landscape will play a huge factor in that. You still got me, Paul?
Yep, still got you, Maz. You're going well.
All right. Any questions so far?
None on my screen yet.
Righto, cool. Here's a list of the clues that there's an inversion. So surface temperature inversions likely to be present, mist, fog, dew or frost. So they're quite easy to see in wintertime. Smoke or dust hanging in the air. So I encourage people, if they see machinery working late in the afternoon or just on sundown, particularly headers and so on, we'll see that dust moving sideways for several kilometres. It's quite a good time to see inversions when there's a bit of dust in the air. So smoke or dust hanging in the air, moving sideways just above the surface. Those nice white fluffy cumulus clouds that we see during the day, they'll build up during the day, but towards the evening they start to flatten out and lengthen out. That's another good indicator that an inversion is setting in. We'll get those large differences between the minimum and maximum temperatures, and that wind speed constantly less than 11 kilometres an hour in the evening and overnight. So watching what that wind does around sunset is a really good way to have some idea of what's going to happen during the night. We get those cool off-slope breezes forming, distant sounds become easier to hear, and smells and aromas. So people who live near, some factory or plant or abattoir or something, they may not smell that during the day, but particularly in the early morning or into the evening, they'll start to smell that. And that's because it's not just chemicals or products that move in that parallel movement of air, it's also smells and dust and things like that, and sounds. If you live near a highway, during the day you mightn't hear the trucks, but during the evening and particularly early in the morning, you'll get quite distinct noise, more so than during the day. So that's, even UHF radios, anyone who uses UHF radios, you will often, on a nice early summer's morning, maybe when you're trying to have a sleep in, you'll hear somebody on the radio that you wouldn't normally hear on your channel. And again, everything's moving in that inversion. So sound, the radio waves during the day, you won't be able to hear that person, but in that nice early morning strong inversion situation, you'll hear people significant distances away.
Mary, that cumulus clouds, usually I say that's just another dry day in paradise when they collapse. Can you tell me a bit what you mean by these cumulus clouds collapsing? What do you mean by that exactly?
So in the morning, you won't see, you know, those fluffy, the real fluffy white clouds you see during the day, the real cottony wool ones. You'll see them sort of mid-morning, particularly in summertime. When you wake up just on daylight, they won't be there. But as the morning progresses and we start to get some heat in the ground, you'll see those white fluffy little clouds. And as people in most agricultural regions will appreciate at the moment, some of them just don't amount to much anymore. But those little clouds start to form, and that's a good indicator that the inversion has broken once we start to see those little fluffy clouds forming. And late in the afternoon, you don't see those real fluffy white ones. They tend to stretch out and flatten out.
Gotcha, thank you.
So wintertime, as I said, is a really good time to see inversions, and I hope people can see this photo. It's taken in wintertime, just on daylight, and you can see those really clear layers in that fog. Once upon a time when we had enough moisture in the air to have fog. So yeah, there's no mixing and dilution. That air movement is parallel to the surface, so any fine droplets that escape from our spray applications can potentially be left in that and move sideways across the landscape, usually towards the lowest part of the catchment. So no turbulence, no mixing of air, just locked in layers moving sideways.
Mary, that paddock is a paddock of fallow paddock. Does having a large crop like corn or cotton or grain sorghum in a very large, advanced state, does that have any diminishing effect on inversion?
Look, not an expert in this, but I believe that irrigated crops obviously are going to have some cooler air above it, so has the potential to impact on how that flows a bit. Probably need to talk to a climatologist, but really as that moves across the landscape, if you spray the paddock next to a sensitive crop and you put stuff into that, it may not necessarily land in the next paddock. It may just actually float over the top of it. So I certainly have seen that happen. It just moves completely sideways and doesn't pull to ground until that inversion breaks, and we get that mixing to pull it down, and they can pull it down in all sorts of situations, either dryland crops, irrigated crops, or environmental situations.
Okay, thank you.
This is an example of some weather data from some weather stations on the Darling Downs. There's a number of weather stations there, and I just pulled a day at random from November 2015, but I would suggest that pretty much any weather station around Australia, you'd be able to find a very classic example of this. And if we look at that early morning wind at 3 a.m, 6 a.m, it's quite low, 6 kilometres an hour down to nothing, and that's very strong inversion conditions. You can see once the sun gets up after 6 a.m, the wind speed starts to increase, and that's showing us that inversion is broken, goes up to some really good daytime wind conditions. But then we can see at 6 p.m, as that sun starts to set, that wind drops off very significantly, and that's our indicator that the inversion is kicking in. So particularly because it's fallen below 11 kilometres an hour, that tells us that there's an inversion set in. So that's a pretty good example across a range of weather stations on the Darling Downs, showing us a very clear inversion set in. So that's just an example.
Sorry, I was going to say, for those who haven't been on the Darling Downs or been to this part of Australia in the Darling Downs, the Darling Downs is a very flat black soil area with the Condamine River flowing through it. It's a very flat area west of Toowoomba, and some of those towns there, Hopelands is out of Chinchilla. That's the furthest west town there is, and it's about 150, 160 kilometres directly west of Toowoomba in the flat soil country. Very flat. All those areas there are very flat. There's no big mountain ranges or hills like there is on the Liverpool Plain or places like that. So to give you some of the topography of what Mary's talking about there with those wind speeds over the 24 hours from all those positions. Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, exactly. No, good point, Michael. It is a particularly flat country, and I'll see differences if you did sort of weather stations from central Queensland or Liverpool Plains or other areas where it's a little bit more undulating. you would see some variation, particularly in the time that wind and the directions of those winds. But yeah, you'll still see some fairly nice clear inversion conditions, looking at a variety of weather data from around Australia. And everywhere I go, from sort of central Queensland through to South Australia, when I ask at my workshops, what does the wind do here at sundown? They, overwhelming majority say it drops off. So fairly common. This is what I simply call the spray clock from New Farm, which is the 24-hour risk profile for summer spraying, and that sort of puts into a really neat diagram for us those risks that I was talking about, that inversion. So if we start on the left-hand side there where the sunrise is, and look at that, the wind speed it's got to get up to that 4 to 5 kilometres an hour after sunrise, and that happens once we get enough heat in the ground, that sun gets up a bit, and usually that's about 20 degrees above the horizon. So when the sun rises up a little bit, we'll start to get that heat, we'll start to get that turbulence. That's when it becomes good for spraying. And some of the things you might look for around that sunrise to see that inversion is breaking is that wind speed. And it might be 2 kilometres an hour, and it might wander up to 4 k's an hour, then back to 1 k an hour, up to 5, and back to 2. That'll sort of muck around a little bit like that, but we need that wind to be consistent. And so, looking at what it's doing and a little bit of practice, it's pretty easy to tell when that inversion is broken, and we can certainly use things like dust or smoke to see how that air is moving. As you progress into the morning, looking at that as the best time to spray. Once we get past that midday, we may need to make some changes to our setup or reassess the risks, but in particular we need to assess the condition of our target and what can we do to manage the increasing delta T's and things like that. As we approach sunset, most people will know that the wind is going to drop around sunset, so we really need to prepare to stop spraying. In that early part of the evening, particularly in summer around Australia, we certainly do have a lot of heat in the ground, and if that wind picks up again in that early part of the evening, it may still be okay to spray. We need to really know how the air is moving, so not just looking at the wind speed, but have some way to identify how that air is actually moving. New Farm are recommending here caution required, and certainly we pretty much need to expect that there's a surface temperature inversion setting in. Later in the night, and they're advising here 10 to 11 p.m. From then on becomes extreme caution required. They're saying, I say, if you are spraying in that part of the night, you're probably the problem. So I just think it's extremely high risk, and we need to avoid that at all possible costs if we can. So that diagram is available. It's a really good visual guide for people to assess the risks and look at probably the potential times of the day that are ideal for spraying and those that are not ideal for spraying. Why are people spraying at night? Well, it's usually based around the delta T, and certainly with our high evaporation rates in Australia, in summer we do need to consider the delta T and use it as a bit of a guide. Even if we're using large spray quantities, those big droplets are going to start to evaporate in our really dry conditions. So the 2 to 8 delta T that is often banded around as the ideal conditions is really aimed at a fine spray quality. So if we're using larger spray qualities, we can push that out. But more importantly than delta T is considering the health of the target and how that weed is going. So measuring the delta T at the weeds rather than up in the air in summertime will give us a bit better idea of what's going on. And most people will know when the weeds have shut down, and obviously there's no point in wasting product and spraying weeds that have shut down and completely stressed out. So really assess the health of the target rather than just relying on delta T. It's certainly to be used as a guide, but it is not the Bible that some areas treat it as. A couple of common myths, and these are very common in relation to inversions. And if the wind speed is between 3 and 15 kilometres an hour, there's no inversion. That is completely false, and my pictures there will tell you it's bullshit, is what I would say in my workshop. So very common mistake. An example of that would be going out at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to spray in an 8 kilometre an hour wind. And I would bet that without even looking at weather data, that you're under inversion conditions. So really, that's probably the most important thing I can stress today. It's not about the wind speed, it's about how the air is actually moving. So as Macca said before, the Darling Downs is really, really flat, but we are quite close to the Great Dividing Range. So we can have very strong winds under inversion, so 20, 30 kilometre an hour winds, but there is still an inversion. So it's not about the wind speed, it's about how the air moves. Another common myth is that we only get inversions when there's low or no wind, and that's completely false as well. Depending on the location and the topography, the wind speed can be quite high and still be under inversion conditions. So having some way to identify how the air is moving, and smoke or dust is a really good way to be able to identify that.
Mary, in past agronomic efforts over the years, I've measured soil surface temperature, and I can assure you some of our black soil can get over 50 degrees centigrade, up to 60 degrees centigrade on the soil surface.
Yep.
What impact would that be having on temperature inversion, or is there an increased possibility of longer temperature inversions at that situation, or how does that impact on what you're talking about today, those high soil surface temperatures?
Those high soil temperatures certainly may actually assist us at night, in that early part of the night, to create a bit of turbulence close to the ground. So even though there may be an inversion setting in, with those really high soil temperatures, we may be able to get enough turbulence and mixing of the air close to the surface for it to be okay for spraying. But you'd have to be pretty confident that you know how that air is moving to use that. And there is certainly some more work being done in this space, research work done in this space to open up those windows and allow us to, have better information to make good spray decisions for night time and during inversions. So we look forward to, well, I certainly look forward to that information, that research becoming available to applicators. I think it's long overdue and we need it quite urgently. So hopefully those high soil temperatures may be able to assist us in those sort of situations. It certainly doesn't assist us in relation to volatile products, which is that's a whole nother webinar on its own, that one. But yeah, so there's pros and cons to those high temperatures.
As you speculated, Mary, that more research data and more knowledge is the key to us to being efficient in our spraying and to stop that spray drift occurring at all.
Yeah, certainly. I think, the more information we can get about these conditions, the better. And hopefully we'll be able to open up a bit more of a window, because, when you look at that new farm spray clock and what, the information that I'm constantly saying, it doesn't give us much time to spray, and it makes it very difficult.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
So the urgency for change, why do we need to change, and what do we need to avoid these inversions? And I don't think anyone would deny that agriculture is already under enough scrutiny. There's, the social licence under which we operate is absolutely critical and becoming ever more critical with political pressures, social media, all of these things that are out there that are putting the spotlight on agriculture for good and bad. But the things that are changing, we've already seen this increased regulation from various products, and the latest one being the new regulations relating to 2,4-D. So increasing regulation is what's going to become of it if we don't change some of our practice, or a lot of our practices, and pretty quickly. So my question to applicators who might disagree with what I say is, can we afford to lose products? Having worked in regulation for so long, I've seen products lost to agriculture, like key products that are really important in our toolbox. And not that we want to use them all the time, but we need to have some choices there. They're not creating new products, so can we afford to lose any more? Currently we've got some scrutiny on the 2,4-D. There's also scrutiny on glyphosate products, and there's the potential for other products to come under scrutiny too. And while I do focus on 2,4-D a lot at the moment, because it's one of the current things that is sort of popping to the top or flooding to the top at the moment, but there's plenty of other products out there that we could potentially lose as well. So I'm saying we need to have changed yesterday, and we certainly need to change today. We need to make any changes we can to try and protect access, and it comes down to the applicators. Chemical companies don't package drift in a drum. It comes down to the way it's applied and the conditions under which it's applied. So that's why I'm very concerned that we need urgent change. The blockers to change, I've got a list here. I think either people love being up late at night, which probably not the case. Too many cowboys. Some people say to me, there's too many cowboys out there. People don't care. I've got a nice little picture there from the SOS Macquarie Valley Group, who've got a YouTube video that cowboys belong on horses, not spray rigs, which I certainly agree with. In my experience, I actually don't think that there's a lot of cowboys out there. Sure there are, and it doesn't matter which industry you go to, be it mechanics, farmers, second-hand car salesmen, lawyers, there's cowboys in every single industry. I would like to think, and in my experience, the cowboys are not the major problem. Sure, they do cause some major problems, but I don't think they're the vast majority. What I believe is probably one of the two major things is the widespread misunderstanding of inversions, and people really just looking at that wind speed, thinking that because they're between 3 and 15 k's an hour, they're right, and not looking at how the air is actually moving. The other major blocker to change is the lack of capacity to cover the country. In those nice ideal spraying windows, they just can't get over the country they need to cover. And so there's a lot of different things that people can do, but unfortunately these things cost money, and no one wants to hear that on the back of a couple of crappy seasons. So yeah, capacity to get over the country in the time frame allocated is probably one of the major blockers to change from what I'm seeing anyway. So I think those things are really in order of importance. I don't think people like staying up all night. Righto, so this is the one that's going to make me as popular as hot beer on Christmas Day. This is when the questions might start, or the fight as such.
That's a good point of yours about the capacity to cover the country. That's a vital point, that the farms are getting bigger, and so are the spray rigs, but the ability to get over that land with those spray rigs these days has diminished, and it takes a bit of time these days. We haven't got the 12 hours on and 12 hours off the tractor to cultivate the countryside. We're using spray rig. It's made us happy for we're not
certainly.
But
sorry.
Still got the capacity to be able to spray your country.
Yeah, and I think that lack of capacity to cover the country is huge. I mean, certainly we do have much better equipment now. Unfortunately, it allows people to go through the night, whereas years ago they probably didn't go through the night because they didn't have GPS steer and all these things. But now they have the capacity to go through the night, so they have the potential to create a lot more problems. And if you look at other operations on the farm, say planting or harvesting, if they can't achieve those things within the time frame, then they'll increase the capacity. A lot of people are a little bit less likely to change the capacity of their spray application. So yeah, lack of capacity is a huge thing. This is what I'm saying now. If you're spraying 2,4-D product at night, then you are most likely part of the problem, and we will lose it. So I know this will start a lot of fights and a lot of arguments, and I get yelled at a lot. But yep, making me about as popular as hot beer on Christmas Day. But my goal is to keep products, and that should be your goal as well. My question is, if you want to spray 2,4-D at night, are you confident enough or have full confidence in your ability to identify an inversion? And if so, are you willing to risk the future of this product on your skills? I think we are too close to the wire, we're too close to the knife edge to risk it. So there are plenty of people out there who will continue to spray 2,4-D at night, and I implore them to start thinking about the future rather than just today's application. So think about in 3 years' time, if you want to use that product, if it's still available, what hoops are you going to have to jump through to buy it, to purchase it, to use it? So, I strongly encourage applicators that, they need to avoid spraying 2,4-D at night if they want to keep the product. I don't want to know what's going to happen if they lose it. It's a good product. It's a useful tool. It can be used safely and responsibly right next to sensitive things if done correctly. So, yeah, putting it out at night, we're in trouble. On my website, there's a resources tab there, and the links to that Graham Tepper book, the GLSE fact sheet, and a variety of other spray information stuff is on there. What we need to do is get information on inversions out to as many people as possible and as fast as possible. So one of the things that people can do if they're concerned about this and interested in sharing information about inversions, on my website there I've got 2 YouTube videos that I've done. So one, using smoke bombs under inversion conditions, so out early in the morning showing that air movement with smoke, and then again a bit later in the morning once the inversion's broken, showing that air movement again with smoke. So certainly the one on inversions, it's people in agriculture tend to learn by seeing, and I often play that video at my workshops, and just to see the faces of applicators when they see that air movement is they're just wow. We would be out spraying, we would think that this is good conditions. So share the link to that video, get as many people as we can to watch it and understand that air movement of inversions, and try and get the information out there, because I think that is one of the major problems, is misunderstanding of inversion conditions. And that's about all from me, Macca, but people can send me hate mail in a variety of ways, and I look forward to my phone lighting up this afternoon.
No one would send you hate mail, Mares, but it's been a great
I'm used to it.
I know you are. Well, we got some questions here, but Lisa, if it's all right with you, I've got one that came in on an email to us a couple of days ago. If I could start with that one, if that's all right. It's from Bruce of Victoria. What are strategies growers can able to be used to spray for longer hours during the day when conditions are safer? Have you any ideas about that sort of answer that sort of question that came from Bruce in Victoria, Mary?
Sorry, what was that, Macca? Just to
mitigate
the risk during the day.
What strategies can growers use to be able to spray for longer hours during the day when conditions are safer? Is that something you could answer, or do you just think that could be someone else in like Billy Gordon or something like that to answer that sort of question?
Yes, certainly. If they're gauging the concerns around delta T and things like that, it's really looking at the condition of that target. But I'm practical enough and reasonable enough to know that nobody's going to go and dump half a load of chemical out because the conditions are starting to deteriorate. So while we need to ensure that we are complying with the label and our legal obligations, things like slowing down, lowering that boom, increasing your water rate and your spray quality, there's a variety of things that people can do to mitigate the risk and to reduce the risk, the use of certain adjuvants, but certainly slowing down and using larger spray qualities are things that they can do to mitigate that risk, even further.
Gotcha. Thanks, Mary. Good answer. Going on to another question from James here. His question, Mary, is given in hot, dry summers there's no suitable spraying conditions between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. daylight, growers need to be able to define inversions very objectively to spray in cooler conditions. Is there scope to develop weather station networks to define exactly when an inversion is present?
Yeah, there certainly are some areas that are putting, inversion towers up as such to identify the presence or absence of an inversion. My comments on that would be, exercise caution. The presence or absence of an inversion does not necessarily mean that it's not good to spray or that it is good to spray. So it's about that air movement, and that research that I spoke about that GRDC is heavily investing in, that inversion research, will hopefully not only tell us whether there is or isn't an inversion present, it will tell us more about the stability or instability of the air, and will potentially open up more windows. So while there's plenty of companies out there selling inversion towers at the moment, even though we sort of needed the science yesterday, I would caution to wait for the science and wait for the best information. My other caution would be, if you are planning on putting up inversion towers, yeah, it will only tell you the presence or absence of an inversion, but please also notify any ag pilots in your region, because my concern is, from a safety perspective, that people are sticking these 10-metre towers up all over the country and not notifying pilots. So please let your local pilots know.
Thank you very much. He's back online again. Are you back there, Paul?
Yeah, it's amazing what bit of knowledge for technology does, Lisa.
Have you got something? Have you got anything else to say as we round up the webinar today?
No, I've got no more questions, but Mary, thank you very much from ourselves and for all the sensible spray people in Eastern Australia. You've done extremely well, and I know you've been able to educate those some of those North American people too. So well done from all of us, mate. You're a credit and you're a real help to our industry, and you'll keep a lot more products on our shelves to purchase in the future, no doubt about that. So I've got no more questions here, Lisa, so I'll pass it back to you if that's all right.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thank you as well, Mary. You've done a great job today, and there's some very good messages for all of us. I'm just going to wind it up now and just say thank you again for everybody for being online. A final word is that I want to say is that there are resources, and the GRDC website, of course, is a great resource, APVMA and CropLife. They all have resources on those websites that will tell you what you should be doing or advising you on what they think you should be doing. So please use those resources. Thank you everybody for attending and for being part of the WeedSmart webinar, and we wish you all a happy Christmas and a great new year. Thank you.